Don't worry about a thing, 'cause Atticus Health will make you feel alright. If you got a tummy ache, or you don't feel right, or if you have a nasty rash, keeping you up at night, don't worry about a thing.
Don't worry.
'Cause Atticus Health will make you feel alright.
I'm Ilana Razbash, and this is Radio Architecture. Good evening from beautiful Bunurong country. We are broadcasting to you live on Radio Karam from unceded Kulin Nation land. As always, we'd love to hear your questions and have you join us in the conversation. Text us on the studio line on 0493 213 831. My conversation partner this evening is Adam Yee, who was a graduate of the Victorian College of Arts. As an undergraduate, he founded Kelzane Theatre, which produced 4 of his operas at La Mama. He has been active in the field of music education since 1998. He is a past president of the Association of Directors of Music in Independent Schools and is active in VCE music assessing and curriculum reviews. Welcome to the program, Adam.
Thanks for having me.
So glad to have you in the studio and to talk about these wonderful intersections of music and soundscape and theatre and the world building that really comes out of that.
Mm. I'm fortunate to have a lot of hobbies.
Yeah, that's true. Sometimes some of our most creative work could be for pleasure or for self, or can be described as a hobby. The question I'm really interested in, and I like to ask all my guests to start off the conversation, is what's your earliest memory of a building or place?
I have a number of very early memories that I've managed to work out are in when I was 3 years old. We'll start with one of them. I distinctly remember reaching for and being unable to reach a light switch. So obviously there's a design aspect of that. If you want 3-year-olds to switch lights on and off, they need to be put lower. I also remember having not a morbid or pathological fear, but definitely a serious concern about falling into the toilet. So again, I only realise now that, adult toilets are the wrong size for 3-year-olds. But probably my distinctive and in many ways a defining memory for me is a near-death experience at, of all places, Hanging Rock, where I was eating a sandwich and there was a big piece of naknik, processed meat in it. And I tried to inhale the whole thing and it got stuck in my throat and I was choking to death. And I remember seeing Hanging Rock through my eyes as I was running out of oxygen and going blue. And fortunately, one of the adults there was sober enough to pick me up by the feet and smack the meat out of my throat. And,
A picnic at Hanging Rock.
Yep, it was unforgettable.
Wow. That's really scary.
Hanging Rock is a really bizarre place. When was the last time you were there?
Not for quite a long time. I personally find it has a very heavy energy. There's something there that doesn't feel welcoming, and I believe also in the First Nations culture, there's quite a bit of lore around that place as well that's quite heavy.
What do you think are some of the more frightening places in Victoria?
Well, I studied at RMIT, as did you as well. And there's the old Melbourne jail that I always found was a bit spooky in its co-location with the university. But what gets more complicated for me is when these prisons like Pentridge get refurbished as hotels. And personally, you could not pay me to stay there. And I know it's a very lovely refurbishment, and many people have commended the project. But for me personally, I could not possibly stay there.
Well, it amazed me to see the Willsmere Asylum repurposed as housing. Have you the big old 19th century asylum in Kew?
Yes.
Apparently, the Ararat Asylum is. I've never been there. Apparently, it's terrifying. But I mean, the natural places that I find quite scary in Victoria, probably Tower Hill. After hanging on, is so strange. Have you ever been to Tower Hill?
Yes, on geography field trip. It's a volcano, Scoria-Corin volcano.
Yeah, it's a series of volcanoes and lakes, and it's also, they say it's a game reserve. So there's a bunch of animals there that just have free run of the place. So if you're eating, they'll just come and take the food straight out of your hand. And it's amazing as an adult to see, terrifying and for kids. But probably the most upsetting place I've been to in Victoria was the Geelong jail, which is like a terrible old 19th century jail building. But unlike the old Melbourne jail where there's like explanatory plaques and they've cleaned it up and, you know, it's got a bit of a Disneyland overlay, with the Geelong jail, they basically marched the last prisoner out, and then someone had the bright idea of opening it to the public, which means there's a guy from Rotary sitting there with a card table and a tin, and you drop a coin in and you just walk around the jail. So it pretty much looks exactly like it looked when it closed in the 70s or 80s, and it's dreadful. Like, you really feel like you're in a prison.
These are quite heavy themes.
Yeah.
What themes did you explore in your opera? Your first one you wrote when you were actually quite young at 17, Don't Open the Door.
I'm not interested in any naturalistic subjects. I like the fantastic and the bizarre. And my favourite genre is horror. So...
what draws you to that?
Look, I didn't know if a particular kind of music led me to horror, or if horror led me to a particular kind of music, or maybe it's the kind of film culture that I had in my family growing up, because we'd have movies at my place. Right, it's movie time, and movie time was we close the curtains, we watch on the TV, we put the sound through the enormous speakers, and we sit on the couch in complete darkness and silence. There was no eating during movie time. There was no talking.
It was serious business.
It was serious business. So, you know, as a child, to have Dad say, "What? It's very exciting. Todd Browning's Freaks is no longer a banned film in Australia, so it's movie night tonight. We're going to watch it." And I'm sitting there watching it thinking, this is the most incredible thing I've ever seen. And my brother and I would record pretty much every horror film that was being broadcast at 2 or 3 in the morning, and we watched them. Some of those films we watched, I don't know, 100 times.
Is it the spook or the scare, or is it spatially something you're interested in there? What are you chasing after in that genre?
I don't know, but I find it utterly compelling. Maybe, I don't know, I guess I have a tendency towards grandiosity. There's an academic in Europe, Patricia McCormick, and she says that one of the attractions of horror is that it's the only genre where human beings are being predated upon.
There's always so many glaring mistakes I find that when I watch them, like, don't go down that corridor. Don't make that decision. Don't walk away from the group. A lot of glaring errors. How about Don't Open the Door, your opera? What was that one about? Would you like to tell the audience?
So Don't Open the Door was an opera I wrote in the heady, alcohol-soaked months between the end of Year 12 and starting university. And I thought, well, I've got to achieve something, you know, in this big break, having, you know, just finished Year 12. So I sat down and I my starting point is always the libretto, the script.
Yes.
And I wrote a 20-minute chamber opera, and I was very fortunate because one of the people working at La Mama at the time, Maureen, was a very good friend of our drama teacher from school. So she said, "You've got to meet Maureen, tell her the project you're doing," and she sort of pushed us into producing it. And one of the great things about being a composer at the Victorian College of the Arts, I studied orchestral performance. I didn't study composition. In fact, I've never really formally studied composition.
What was your instrument?
Oboe.
Oboe.
I identify as a recovering oboist. Okay, quick oboe joke. So, why is an oboist like a blind javelin thrower?
Why?
You don't have to be very good to attract everyone's attention.
Oboe gets a lot of solos.
Yeah. So, yes. But the good thing about being a composer at the VCA was if I'd finish a piece, I would just go through practice rooms. I was much more of a bully at university, and I would drag people together and put them in a rehearsal room and say, "Right, we're playing my piece now." So one of the things I say to young composers who I'm working with or I encounter is you can't write for the desk, and don't think that what you're doing in a computer is constitutive of art music in the strict sense. It's you playing on a computer, right? And unless human beings are actually playing it, you're missing a key part of the communication chain of music as an art form.
Absolutely.
Yep. So, yeah, you write for the people around you who will actually play your music, and you learn by having it played. Anyway, I still haven't told you what Don't Open the Door was about. So it's about a young couple who are sadomasochists, and they go to the archetypal cabin in the woods where they're visited by a vampire.
It's very much still on the horror theme there.
Yeah. But because they have no regard for their physical safety, it just becomes a kind of pleasant conversation. And this one of the later times we staged it was a bit difficult because there's a scene where one of the characters has to destroy this cup he's using, and he actually cut his hand open. So for most of the show, he was there just dripping blood onto the stage. And it's great that he carried on, but you can't plan for those moments. You just have to embrace them when they happen.
They say theatre is an incredibly dangerous place, one of the most dangerous buildings you can be in.
Yeah. I've got a really good friend, Simon. He was my best friend at school. We've maintained a really good relationship. He's a production manager at the Royal Opera House. And some of the stories he tells about things that have happened in the theatre, in good theatres. There's one particular theatre in Melbourne I'll name later that's like kind of cursed. Like dangerous, scary, bad things happen there.
With theatre ghosts?
Mostly with occupational health and safety. But in terms of bleeding on stage, I reminded myself of another funny story. So in my second opera, I decided that all of the really horrific things would happen in blackout and silence, right? And I was kind of inspired by Val Lewton's film Cat People, which was the first horror film where you never saw the monster.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's important not to see the monster too much. It's really important. What is it, the third Aliens film? Where you just see the monster so much you just sort of want to, slap him on the back and roll a cigarette for him. It gets ridiculous. So it was a very loud, confronting piece of music. But then whenever, it's terrible, I've got to stop snapping my fingers. Whenever something really horrific would happen, it would go black and silence, and then the lights would come up and there'd be some kind of grotesque tableau for the audience to sort of take in. And my oboe teacher at the time, Anne Gilby, still a really good friend, brought her then 6 or 7-year-old daughter, Sadira, to the show. And the first time this happened, the lights come up and this character, a gypsy fortune teller, is just covered in blood. And everyone's sort of silent and shocked. And Luca goes, look at the blood, look at all the blood there. So again, it's just one of those wonderful things that happen in the theatre,
amazing play with the light and the senses to really affect people's perception of that space. Was that a longer production? Was it still an operetta?
That was like an hour long.
Okay. Did you start getting set changes?
Yes, I started using a lot of different scenes. So, shall I talk about the plot of the second show?
By all means.
So, I mean, I haven't looked at this in a long time. We staged it in 1993. What were you doing in 1993?
That's my secret.
Were you negative something? Anyway, so it was called The Road to Hell is Paved with Slaughter. And it was about a rabbinical student called Chaim who makes a kind of a pact to see into the future, as a result of which he gets told a succession of things that are going to happen to him of increasing awfulness. And then the rest of the opera is just these things playing out. So he meets a group of necrophiliac gravediggers and he gets involved in a kind of Kabbalistic resurrection of a corpse who then goes on a killing spree. And then finally he ends up being sucked down to hell where he has to play a game of chess with the devil. That's like a homage to Ingmar Bergman's Seventh Seal. And and it ends with everyone just advancing on the audience, chanting at them in a really like the orchestra and the cast and everyone just like sort of doing a sort of zombie move on the audience. And then, of course, like these blackout moments for all of the peak drama points. So that was a lot of fun. It's very difficult to talk about the third opera because it was kind of 4 shows happening at the same time. It was a bit of a 3-ring circus. It was probably less popular and successful, but for me, like the musical things that we're doing were really important.
That was Bangers.
Yeah. So Bangers, the titular character Bangers is a homeless violinist who collects newspaper. But there's also a transsexual psychiatrist who has a very awkward relationship with all of her clients. She sort of links all of the different people in the show. And then another character is a secret agent, another character is a bikie. And all of these people had their own strange journey through this show. And, I mean, obviously I'm glad I wrote it, but I wouldn't consider any of those part of my mature
works.
Yeah.
What do you say to people who say that opera is conservative and elitist? They don't even consider engaging with performing arts.
I would like to examine both of those terms. So is opera conservative? Well, it depends on what opera you go to, doesn't it? The kind of opera I'm interested in writing obviously isn't a 19th century form. In fact, the last opera I wrote didn't really have any singing. Not that I'm against singing, but
that was Camilla.
Yeah. Strictly speaking, it was a melodrama in that it was through composed music with spoken dialogue on top. But all of the people in the show pretty much were singers because I wanted them to have a musical projection of these texts. That's not true. There was I think there were 3 notes that were sung in the show by a minor character who sings them off stage. The next show, I'm working on 2 shows in my mind at the moment, and they will contain singing, but it won't be sung all the way through because it gets so tiring. And also, I need words to come quicker than they can be conveniently sung.
Can you share with us some of the themes or ideas behind these brainchilds?
Okay, so Camilla, the 4th opera I wrote hasn't been staged yet, and I probably will never see it staged in my lifetime. It's just too big. And what I would say...
What do you mean by big?
My advice to young people is don't spend your 20s writing a massive opera that's unstageable.
Oh, it's like spatially big production big.
Well, it's got 1 actor and about 50 puppets. And it's set in southwest Tasmania. and parts of it set in Hobart, parts of it are set in the wilderness, and other parts are set in the Macquarie Harbour penal colony.
Now I'm seeing all these themes of nature and prisons that we mentioned in the first few minutes of our show are coming together. I can see how that line of inquiry emerges for you.
There's a lot of spooky stuff in Tasmania. If you want to do Aussie Southern Gothic, you go to Tasmania.
Yes.
Yeah. So that is the story of the convict cannibal Alexander Pierce. But what I did is I spent months and months in the Mitchell Library in Sydney looking at the original documents about his cannibal adventures in the Tasmanian wilderness. And he gave over, a little bit like Jesus Christ, Lahavdil, he gave over, to make a distinction, he gave over his story to 4 different people, right? And the accounts mostly line up, but in some points they don't really line up. But they're close enough to know that it was a reliable account. So he escaped from Macquarie Harbour twice, not once but twice, and he became the first European to cross Tasmania from west to east. And on the way, he survived by eating all of his companions. Yeah, it's a pretty amazing story. And the reason he didn't get executed after the first escape is because no one believed what he told them.
He confessed.
Yeah.
And they still didn't believe him.
Because it was so crazy what he was saying he did. You know, like eating 7 people one by one. And obviously, you know, because of my great love for horror, I thought this is a great, you know, Aussie horror story that deserves telling. I think people have subsequently made a film about it. I haven't seen it. I didn't want to
ruin your opera idea.
Yeah, I wanted
then.
to stay pure. So the opera itself, as I say, there's one singing character who's singing entirely fragments of Pierce's confession. So it's his voice and his words, but, you know, woven together into a kind of plot. And yeah, so, and the reason for all of the puppets, of course, is because things have to happen to the characters that can't happen to human beings on a stage. So, yeah, that was the show. And that's not true. Not all of the text covered. There are a few critical arias where I've taken terrible poetry from the Hobart Town Gazette, which was the newspaper of the day. And it's amazing the sheer quantity and the sheer awfulness of the poetry that people were sending into the Hobart Town Gazette. And again, I sat in the State Library here and I read 10 years worth for the whole time that Pierce was alive in Australia. I read every issue of the Hobart Town Gazette just to get a feel of what kind of a crazy place this was. And I used some of the terrible poetry where it was closely related to plot points. So there's these set pieces. And they're mostly about death.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation that when you're composing music and writing music, you're thinking about the people that are playing it, and in a way you're writing for them and for that act of playing communally.
Yes.
What about the people who are watching these operas? What's the consideration towards the experience of the audience experience? How do you want them to feel?
Sorry, I've had so many different answers for this question over the years. Okay, so one of my dreams is to create a ghost train that you'll have to describe my face for the people who are just listening.
Yeah, this is probably a great time to switch over to the YouTube link, listeners. You can see us in the live stream.
I want to design a ghost train when people come, like adults, when adults come off it, they look like this.
Distraught.
Yeah, like really, really upset.
Why?
I guess because that's the kind of reaction that I typically want to have to art. You know, I want transformation, wonder, insanity. I want something that's the opposite of the everyday. Yes. So what do I want the audience to feel? Well, I mean, obviously I want people to have a good time, but they've got to kind of accept the preconditions imposed by what the kind of things that I create. I mean, I spend a lot of time writing what are called concert hall music, music for ensembles and things to play and in art music venues. But I don't think I'll ever go back to that because the audience for that is literally smaller than the number of people playing it. And we're talking about trios and quartets. Like it is such a peripheral discourse. And I think that's a shame, but there's no point lamenting that.
Yeah.
No one cares about new music.
The authenticity matters.
Let me tell you about an interesting experience I had at the St Kilda Library. So the CD collection, I still collect CDs. I have thousands of them. The CD collection at the Port Phillip Library, where my beautiful niece now works, Lulu, it's incredible. Like they have stuff there you won't find anywhere else. And I was borrowing some discs of really obscure 20th and 21st century music. And I said to the librarian, I've got to compliment you. Your CD collection here is unbelievable. And he looks at my library card and he says something that I don't hear very often. He says, "Are you Adam Yee, the composer?" I said, "Why, yes, I am." I said, "How have you heard of me?" He said, "Well, I used to go to a lot of new music concerts." And I said, "Well, it's a small world, isn't it?" And he looks at me and says, "Well, that one is."
Wow.
Yeah. What a slap down. And there's a wonderful French expression, which I'll say in English because I don't speak French. It's called staircase wit. Right? It's the clever thing you think of when you're walking down the stairs at the end of the party. So I experienced a very powerful case of staircase wit when I walked out of the library feeling a bit like slapped around. And I thought, if only I had had the presence of mind to say, unlike the world of public librarianship, maybe it's best I didn't say that.
Perhaps not, especially since libraries are resurrecting very much in their central importance. They're actually quite full, quite busy with students and very well used by their community.
I know, I love my local library, but I'm a member of a bunch of libraries. I'm a member of the Lamb Library. Shout out to all of the Lamb Library users out there. It's this enormous Jewish library full of incredible stuff. And they always have a ton of secondhand books there, which is a bit dangerous. That's basically my crack, really. And I'm a member of the Kadima Library. And during COVID, because I was at Monash, any book I wanted from any academic library in Australia would just appear in the post. It was incredible. When I got to like 3 bookshelves full of stuff that had just come out of the library, I knew I had a problem. And, the first step is admitting that you're powerless, right? So that was where I was at with library borrowing. There's a reason I was telling you the story about the librarian slapping me out. Yeah, no one cares about new music. So I'd find, maybe like 3 people would show up to a performance of a piece of music I'd written for like cello and piano or a sextet or something. But if you put a show on, I mean, Camilla was the most recent show I've done. In its second season, we did 13 performances. They were all full.
Amazing.
And we weren't at Le Mans. This is before the fire. We were at the courthouse, not the smaller space. So there's no way I could get that number of people to come and listen to a piece of concert music I've written. But it's not just about the audience. I like being in the theatre. When I finished school, I kind of wanted to do either acting or music. And I chose music. But, what didn't happen, which kind of disproves the possibility of time travel, is like a wizened version of my future self saying, do music and film.
Could be making horror movies.
I really wish I had have done film. I love the theatre and I'm going to stick with it. But when people are looking back at this time in 100, 200, 500 years, I think we're going to be talking about screen culture more than anything else. That's my gut feeling.
How do you engage with that mise en scene though in your theatre work? Are you really involved in the set design as well? Or you hand that part over?
Not so much. I mean, obviously, I give a fairly detailed description of how I imagine the set and everything looking and what characters look like and the sort of I put a lot there, and then I hand it over to the director to do whatever they want with. Yeah. And I've been really fortunate. On Camilla, I was working with my old drama teacher from Melbourne High School, Karen Wakeham, who is a gifted director. And it was wonderful to see. We're very collaborative and very, very consultative. And as we got closer to crunch time, she would just say, no, this has to happen. It's going to happen this way now. But she was so focused on a particular... As the rehearsal process went on, and we were rehearsing for months, she imposed more and more of her own ideas on it. And I was so happy with that process, because at the end of the day, she's forgotten more about theatre than I know. And just, I mean, I've talked about the plots of the first the first 4 operas. The 5th opera, Camilla, is an adaptation again, but this time of a very famous novella by Sheridan Le Fanu. Have you read it?
No, I haven't.
You totally want to read this tonight. It's amazing. So there is a kind of framing story where this character, Laura, who's not so much an unreliable narrator as a kind of appealingly clueless narrator, has this vision as a child of this black shape crawling onto her bed. And maybe it's a human, a ghost, a panther, who knows. And she wakes up from this vision. And then she tells the story of how there's a carriage crash near the Schloss where they're living in Austria. And the mysterious inhabitants of the carriage ask them to look after this injured woman, Camilla. And they bring Camilla into the mansion. And she sort of starts to recover and forms this intense, let's be honest, homoerotic relationship with Laura, and is just drawing her into her world to the point where Laura is getting sicker and sicker and Camilla's getting healthier and healthier. Anyway, it's an amazing condensation of all of the most exciting tropes of the vampire genre in one short story. And it's a complete masterpiece. It's been adapted. Don't see the recent film adaptation. It's complete crap. There's a web series adaptation that's okay, and there's a French language graphic novel that's mind-blowing. But, yeah, I think it definitely needed operatic trip. There's actually one of the Karnstein trilogy films from Hammer Horror is really closely based on Camilla, but that's only if you're a trash master.
Yeah, this is actually so interesting for me because it's a topic I never really come near at all, horror. It's something I don't personally enjoy watching.
Read Camilla.
Despite a mild maybe phase of my teenage years for a few years that I dabbled. And there is such an expansive and rigorous cultural movement, cultural precedent, literary precedent. It's not actually the madness some people who don't understand horror think it is. That there's a whole scheme there. We just had a text message come in from Ella. Thank you so much for texting us. Good evening, Ilana. Adam is clearly a genius, a fascinating man in every way. But can you pause so we can hear some of his music? Where can people listen to your music?
There's not a huge amount of my music out there in the world. On YouTube, I've recorded a few fragments of Camilla. There's some of my recorded music at the Australian Music Centre site, but, you know, not a lot of stuff is commercially available. But definitely get a sense of what my music sounds like by looking for those Camilla fragments on YouTube and through Australian Music Centre.
Very excellent point, and we'll also share some links.
Yep.
Share some links to those up on the Instagram. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about some of your studies at the RMIT Spatial Information Architecture Laboratory, SILE, at my old alma mater, RMIT University. Interesting place.
I had a ball doing that, and it was 5 years really well spent. My supervisor, Lawrence Harvey, was so supportive, and I hadn't done a lot of serious academic writing or research up until that point, so that was a great thing to learn. And the other thing that I hadn't really engaged with was using computers, and the main research topic was algorithmic composition. So I was using a bit of software that I think there's one other guy I found in Australia using it from IACAM in Paris, and the program's called Open Music, and it's kind of like imagine signal processing software that applies itself to music notation, and you can build really complicated things in it. So I decided to build this fabulous machine for composing the music that I compose, and as a result of that I had to think of ways to rigorously systematize every compositional process I'd used up until that date.
Wow.
Yeah, basically building a kind of weird robotic exoskeleton of my compositional practice.
Through a critically reflective lens as well, I'd imagine. RMIT is very big on that.
Well, as my friend Matthew Shlomovitz said, it's a typical Australian higher degree where you write a thesis about yourself. Although what I would say is that I was writing a thesis about something that I'd never done before in the course of its unfolding, and it resulted in a couple of really good recordings. Actually, I'm wondering if the recordings are on the RMIT thesis repository, because it was project exegesis. So the thesis is there, and I think the scores and maybe the recordings are sitting there as well. And I was really happy with the music that I produced for that. But then I had a lot of really interesting experiences in RMIT. The first thing I learned, the most important thing, is that architects are really snappy dressers. Yeah, I could never compete. The architects always showed up and they had like designer glasses, really cool briefcases. The other thing that architects are really good at is PowerPoints. They're great at PowerPoints.
We use PDF.
Yeah. And I'm not yet just scrolling this massive scrolling thing.
This laboratory was in the basement of the design school, of actually the architecture school.
Yep.
So, and one day it popped up and it was there, and no one quite knew what they did. So I'm glad to get a bit of an insight and hear about algorithmic composition.
There were all kinds of interesting things happening in there. I was the only kind of pencil and paper composer there. Everyone else there was an electroacoustic composer of some form, pretty much. And that was interesting to see what they're doing, although, I'll be honest, it did just confirm my commitment to working with music notation and human performers.
Yeah, I was just about to ask about that ownership of the creative process and ownership of the design intent.
I mean, I'm just so interested in what good performers do. And I think interpretation is a critical part of the communication chain of music. And if it's missing, then, there's a wonderful scene in, have you seen Aliens?
Haven't. You'll hear about all the horror movies I haven't watched.
It's more sci-fi. But I think you would, I think it's worth seeing. There's an opening scene where Ripley is such a great character. The Sigourney Weaver character is strapped into this landing craft as they're about to land on alien world. And she asks someone there, so how many missions have you done? He says, 37. And she says, and how many of those were simulations? He says, 35. I mean, I don't remember what the exact numbers are. And she just gives him this shoulder shrug, eye roll. Look, I don't care about your 35 simulations, And I'll be honest with you, that's kind of the way I feel about electronic music. At the end of the day, there's simulations of what I consider genuine, fully fledged musical act, which is a creator, an interpreter, an instrument. I think that the physical quality of the instrumentarium is something amazing. There's
such an embodied action.
Yes, there's an accretion of history in the instruments that we have. That's why would you not exploit that? And then there's the hall, the chair, the audience member, the auditory system, the brain, the experience of the listener. I like all of those points to be as interesting as possible.
So important. There's physical acoustics of the space, the acoustics of the instrument, from that very micro to the full macro of the experience.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, music is at one level sensation, and many people who are musical will talk about their first experience of finding an instrument. Or I remember, talking about reaching for the light switch. I remember reaching for the piano keys and just being able to touch them down. And that feeling of, I'm this tiny person and I can make this enormous sound. The other thing about playing a piano, of course, is that there's this huge soundboard at the back that starts resonating when you push a key down. And that's an overwhelming physical experience for a child. I mean, not all children are equally attuned to music. I teach mostly in the high school, but one day a week I'm teaching in the primary and early learning centre. And I have like 15, 20 minutes with each year level. And I'm teaching them little songs and actions, and I've also written a curriculum for the school. And with the upper primary classes, I'm taking them through a simple version of that curriculum. It's all song based, and there'll be one or two kids in the early learning centre who just look back at me and sing everything I do back to me perfectly and in tune.
Perfect pitch.
Yeah, well, perfect intonation. I mean, and I bring a ton of instruments to play for them, and I'll just be playing on an instrument, and there'll be one or two kids sitting there, and they're just enraptured, That's what it's like for me. I mean, I was very fortunate to have an absolutely brilliant teacher who kind of shaped every aspect of my thinking and being when I was in grade 5. Her name was Hannah Marocchi, and Hannah was a music teacher and a poetry teacher and a literature teacher, and she was a wonderful singer, and she played the guitar and just encouraged all of our interests. And her daughter's a wonderful singer. One of her sons is an amazing clarinet and saxophone player, and they'd come in and perform for us. And I remember thinking, I want to do this. This is the most amazing I've ever seen. So I'd never had music lessons up until that point, although my father had taught me how to read music when I was quite young, because I just kept bugging him to teach me songs on the piano by rote. And that's a good path, I think, if you want to be a composer, because I was very comfortable with the manipulation of musical phenomena on the page. But it's not a great path if you want to be a fabulous executive musician, like my wife. I mean, she's a superb pianist because she started very early and had great teachers all the way through. Whereas I only started playing formally in year 7. Mm-hmm. When I thought, there's a clarinet, I can learn the clarinet here. Well, my father played the clarinet at school, and Ilana Razbash plays the clarinet. I think I'll do that. I'll play clarinet.
10 years later, you had your first opera.
Yeah. So
that time at SAIL, that was your master's. Tell me about your PhD.
Okay, the PhD.
Ongoing.
My advice to younger people is, before you attempt a PhD, just decide on answerable questions that are small and contained and limited, and that you can knock off in 2 or 3 years. Instead, a little bit like the Cannibal PS opera and a little bit like the 5 years of the Masters, I basically wanted to go up onto a mountain, climb into a cave, read everything I could possibly read, and emerge when I had the answer to life, the universe, and everything. This is like my 13th year of working on it. I'm quite happy with the draft I have now. The first complete draft I put together was more than 200,000 words. I had no idea how long it was. I was just writing until I got to the end. And then I looked at that, and I'll be honest with you, that was the beginning of like a downward spiral into clinical depression, because I thought, I've been working on this for so long and I've got a draft that's so massive, I don't know how to finish this thing. It just became a brick wall. But I've since managed to do another draft, and it's hovering around 116,000 words. And I just need to get that down to about 80, and I'm done.
Professional editors are allowed on PhDs, aren't they?
I think I've got to wade through this particular cesspool myself. But, the red pen's out. I just need to kind of cut a third out of it. And I already know I'm seeing whole bits now that don't need to be there. But the basic structure of the thesis is I'm talking about technology, which I think has had a largely negative effect on education. And then I'm talking about, I'm calling it cultural devaluation, but I'm looking at all of those things that I think are constitutive of kind of anti-humanist trends in culture and in academia and in society.
Anti-humanist. Say
Yeah.
more.
I've got a big problem with the postmodern project. Yeah.
Say more.
I don't know if we want to open that whole can of worms, but I think the world's pretty meaningful, you know? I want to live in a meaningful world. And I think postmodernism,
Cynical.
it's cynical, and it's like they've switched the oven off and they're sort of talking about the fading warmth of the oven. But, you know, I just think people should be cooking things, you know? They should be making something. And it seems to me like a negative, a wholly negative philosophy. And also, I don't know, I'm kind of suspicious of theory in general, you know?
How does that relate to technology and musical education?
Well, let's think about some of the things that's happened in the past 100 years with music and technology. Now, recording came along, and you think that that would be a great thing, right? That we can record music now. It actually resulted in a massive contraction of the number of people who are actually able to read, write, play, and sing music. The other thing is because the new medium. I mean, I'm very influenced by an American thinker called Neil Postman, and one of the things he talks about are media effects. So as soon as you engage with a particular medium, then you're going to be answering to the requirements of that medium itself. He believed that media were constitutive of an actual environment, and that everything you pick up, and this is McLuhan's insight. He said, you can pick up a hammer, right, and it means I can break the window, but it also means I can't thread a needle, right? So any bit of tech you pick up might give you power and reach, but it will have a necessary blunting effect as well. So we get used to the sound of recorded music, right? Which means that, my auntie singing a song around the piano at home, well, what's the good of that when I can listen to a professional singer? It also means that people start to judge their own performance against professional recordings. Now, I guess this, in a way, is very much the same process of my teenage students, not so much at my current place, but at my last place. They're desperately worried about their appearance because they're constantly exposed to perfect-looking people being, bombarded with this stuff on social media. Same thing happened with music. Again, and I'll give you a more recent example. So I mentioned before that I collect way too many CDs. Now, when I was at high school, I could just scrape enough money together to buy a CD every 2 or 3 weeks. And I would get that CD. I had a CD player in my bedroom that I could operate with my toes. And my father told me that, and I have to understand, I'm not traumatized by my father's directness and honesty. I actually really appreciate it. He said, look, son, there's no point buying speakers for you. I'll just give you a good pair of headphones. No one wants to listen to the music you're listening to, right? And he was quite correct. So I had really good headphones and a CD player I could operate with my feet. And I would get a disc, and for 3 weeks, I would listen to the entire disc every night and read the liner notes to the point where I could sing along with every part of it, right? And that was my musical education, yeah? So you might think it's a huge advantage that the entire corpus of world musical history is available through an app. I would suggest to you that that's a problem, right? Because, and again, this is another Postman insight. The problems of a society with too much information are kind of similar to the problems of a culture with not enough information. You can die from malnourishment, and you can die from hypersatiation, right? witness the salami at Hanging Rock, right? You can have too much of a good thing, yeah? So kids are listening to music all the time, or an algorithm is picking it for them. They don't know the artist, they don't know the band, they don't know background about the music. I mean, the sleeve notes in CDs and vinyl were amazing. It was like you would learn all this information about the performers and the conductor and the orchestra, the composer. That's just gone. So it's a deracination of knowledge. And all I've talked about so far is recording, right, and the impact of that. You can look at any music or educational technology in the same way, and you see for all of the good things, there have been bad things as well. Technology, it's always a give and a take. So again, people are saying AI, well, it's going to revolutionise. Well, no, we've heard that about everything. You know, there's a wonderful book by Margaret Cassidy called Bookends, in which she talks about the history of educational technology in the 20th century. And it was you see the same patterns. She brings all the documentary evidence. We're going to bring in SRA labs. We're going to bring in film. We're going to bring in radio. We're going to bring recorded things. We're going to bring in projectors. And so I said, this is going to revolutionize teaching. Often the claim is we're not going to need teachers anymore. This technology is so good. Everyone's going to learn a lot more, a lot quicker, and retain it. And the same problems always come. You know, because at the end of the day, just like listening to music, learning is something that happens between people's ears. And the only way that you can get learning to happen is, well, for a start, you can't make someone learn something. You can just create the preconditions where it's more likely they'll learn. You'll just hope to make the kids more teachable, and yourself as well. But as I always say particularly to my long-suffering 14-year-old daughter, I think it's a particular circle of hell to be the child of teachers, because I think every teenager deserves the experience of upsetting their parents. But I don't know. I don't get upset with my teenage children because I've seen and heard it all. but as I always say to my daughter when she complains about school, if you want to be Hermione Granger, you have to find the room of requirement. Now, to explain that to our non-Harry Potter audience, Hermione is the smartest girl at Hogwarts, and she has this is wonderful moment. I've actually read this when I've lectured on education in the past. What's it in? A listener will call in with it. So they had this terrible teacher for the Defence Against the Dark Arts, Dolores Umbridge. She's not teaching them anything, and they're sitting around in the Gryffindor common room, and Hermione turns to Harry and Ron and says, look, what are we complaining about learning nothing? I'm the smartest kid that's ever been in this school, and Harry's the chosen one, and Ron is our friend, and why don't we just teach ourselves, right? So they find this room, the room of requirement. If you need it enough, it'll just appear, right? And I say, if you want to be Hermione, you've got to find the room of requirement. You have to teach yourself. Don't get me wrong, it helps to have great teachers, but at the end of the day, it's you that does the learning.
Got to be self-motivated.
Yeah, always. We've fallen down so many rabbit holes here.
It's all parallel. It's all the same for
Pretty
me.
much.
I find the reason we cover so many different topics on this program, and I speak to so many different and diverse and interesting practitioners, people like yourself who do so many different things, is because in my view, it's all architecture. Architecture is about ideas and these big worlds of ideas that we talk about, build big worlds of thinking, underpins architectural production. But then it's the people and the buildings that we need to support those people and their lives and the great work that they do.
Have you ever heard of a German-American philosopher called Susan Langer?
I have, actually.
Yeah. Langer is a particular goddess of mine because she wrote a couple of books on philosophy of art that completely changed my vision of the world in every way. And again, she's just yet another one of those thousands of figures who was just born with the wrong gender at the wrong time, and no one really took her seriously when she was one of the absolute finest minds of her generation. And I keep talking about Langer wherever I go, and people, oh, you know, she was very active in the 1950s. I go, yeah, well, guess what? Mind-blowingly amazing thought from the 1950s. It's still good now. You know, would you believe it? There's no expiry date on great thinking.
Yeah,
So,
no use by on good ideas.
so she had this theory about art, right? She said that art is always a symbol. I'm condensing like a massive body of work here into a few.
I'm loving it.
So art is always a symbol, right? It's a symbol that takes in ideas, but it's always a form that represents some kind of feeling, right? It's taking us into an emotional world as well as into a world of ideas, right? That's kind of the first big insight in the way I talk about Langer. She also says that we have two very distinct types of symbol system that we use as human beings. So there's the type that we're using now, discursive symbolism of language, right? And you can tell that something's a discursive symbol because it could be translated. We could be having this conversation in a First Nations language. We could be having it in French or German. Obviously, it's going to be different, but the actual meaning of it is amenable to translation. And then you have something called art, where its very meaning and its form are in a one-to-one mapping, right? You can't imagine that particular poem being rendered as a pot, right? It actually has to exist in that form and exist in its totality in order to be the artwork. There, she described them as untranslatable forms. And then she said that every art form is defined by a kind of illusion contract that it takes you into, right? And she's not using the word, she's using the word illusion like in the sense of the magic of the art form rather than any trickery, right? So I'll give you an example. So for visual art in all of its forms, she said there's an illusion of space operating, right? So with painting and photography, right? When we look at it, if it's done well, it transcends its two-dimensional quality by taking us into an imagination of space.
Into a whole universe.
Right. And that's why when I look at bad art, did you ever go to the Museum of Particularly Bad Art that used to run at Chapel of Chapel?
No.
It was one of the greatest things on the Melbourne Cultural Calendar, but I'm not going to talk about it now.
I am mindful of the time.
I know.
And that I should ask my last question.
Anyway, so a painting takes you into an illusion of space that transcends the flat form. Sculpture uses illusions of space where we reflect on our own embodiment in relation to the object as we move around it. And about architecture, she said architecture is about illusions of lived experience, right? So when you walk into an architectural space, you're immediately invited to imagine the life of yourself as you progress through this building, right? What an image. So her idea for, but I love that the way the space thing is just drawn out through all of those forms. In terms of music, she said that and I'm not going to talk about this now because I won't be able to stop talking about it, but music, you think it's about sound? No. Langer said that music is actually about time.
Yes.
It's about the way time unfolds with a secondary illusion of space. Because when we hear high and low and tense and untense and busy and non-busy, it affects our perception of space as well as the forms of human movement.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, Langer's amazing.
Many.
The book to read is Feeling and Form. It will change your life forever.
Thank you so much. So many incredible precedents and references and so many ideas to just delve into. I want to ask my last question, and that's what gives you hope?
In almost every dimension, life has gotten better for most people in the last century. People are living longer, they're healthier, they're better educated. Yeah, things have gotten way better. And if you don't believe me, look at advertising from the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah, the stuff they needed to sell you back then.
Yep. Yeah.
It's very true.
I mean, obviously, like, what are the likely catastrophic situations? I don't know. The tyrannical countries take over the whole world and democracy collapses and history takes you usually backwards. I don't know. I don't think that's going to happen.
Thank you so much for joining me on the program, Adam.
Pleasure.
Thanks for joining me for another evening of radio architecture with Ilana Razbash. This live show was broadcast and recorded in the Radio Karim studio on Bunurong Country. You can replay the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and supporting community radio. Take care.
Hi, I'm Disco Dave from London, England, and whenever I'm in Australia, and in fact even when I'm not on